So I am ready to start. We are ready to start. Was going to wait either 5 minutes or until we had about 100 people who were online, and we're over 100. So welcome everyone to the Bartlett Together Festival. Today's session is let me find my slide. Well, can we actually, Claire or Lauren, do you want to share the slides from today for us? So the title of today's session is Every Breath You Take in Pursuit of Clean Air. Some of you might remember that song. Welcome to what I hope will be an interesting and interactive discussion this morning. Got some really great panelists, and I do encourage you to come up with your own questions. We've left some time at the end for participant questions, so be thinking of those. And I have been given a note. Thanks, Nishat. I have an additional note to read. I've got lots of different instructions. So my apologies. Let me get this. I believe this session will be recorded. Thank you. Let's see. To ask a question, use the Q&A function on the bottom of the screen at any time during the session. You can submit your own question or upload existing questions. I think that is I think that's the part that I missed and was supposed to read. So thanks, Nishat. Hopefully there isn't anything else I've missed already. But so outline and start with a very brief introduction, an introduction to our fantastic panelists. Then we're going to have a bit of a background on air quality more generally as an evolving problem, the health impacts, what's going on with ambient or outdoor air pollution right now, and what outdoor to indoor air pollution, what those differences are, how they're related, very briefly, because we're obviously a school of the built environment. We need to understand how the indoor air as well as the outdoor air impact our health and what's going on there. We're going to have a brief introduction to systems diagrams and some work that Lauren's been doing, and then some moderated content. So we can get a chance to get the discussion going, followed by all the great questions that you guys will be coming up with. So I wanted to start briefly to tell you sort of how this happened. My recent work has been focused on one method to try to improve indoor air quality, and that's through the use of portable air purifiers. They're really simple to install. They don't require any kind of central air handling equipment. They're flexible in where they can be located in a building. And so it gives these devices a lot of clear advantages over other types of air cleaning methods for buildings. However, despite the potential effectiveness of these devices, there remains the risk of unintended consequences of any kind of large-scale interventions that might employ them. And then there are, frankly, many parts of the world, especially those that are particularly vulnerable to poor indoor air quality, where these devices just simply aren't a viable option. So in discussions with Duncan, we were coming up with some interesting comparisons between that problem and other similar sort of tricky or sticky problems with climate change. And I thought, what a great thing to discuss about what's going on with socioeconomic inequalities, that the work that Lauren has been working on, the great resource we have with Claire, working with air quality and health. So that's how this started. In terms of brief introductions, I joined UCL's Institute for Environmental Design and Engineering as a doctoral researcher in 2019. Prior to UCL, I was an associate professor of architecture and the director of the Integrated Design Lab at the University of Idaho in the US, where my primary research was on building controls for thermal comfort and energy efficiency. And I hold degrees in architecture and environmental health. And my research has been mostly focused recently on exposure to indoor air pollutants. So I convened these three people who I believe provide a diversity of knowledge and probably opinions to discuss the quality of air we breathe, public health implications, social inequalities of air pollution exposure and control, and environmental justice issues, both in the UK and globally. And I hope will challenge you to consider novel areas of research and potentially solutions of your own. Dr. Claire, and I apologize, I didn't ask Claire if it's Heaviside or is that, so Dr. Claire Heaviside is a NERC Independent Research Fellow, Associate Professor in the UCL Institute for Environmental Design and Engineering. Her fellowship investigates the impact of the urban heat island effect on health and using atmospheric modeling and health impact assessment. Her research interests cover climate change impacts, particularly on health, or urban climate and meteorology, the urban heat island, air pollution, and heat waves. Her research is often multidisciplinary in nature, with application to the physical and environmental sciences, as well as public health and policy. Claire's current research looks at the impacts of climate and environmental change, particularly in terms of health and in cities. Her work links environmental and demographic factors to carry out exposure and health impact assessments for temperature and air pollutants such as ozone, particulate matter, and nitrogen dioxide. So really, really interesting and varied work, particularly working in the planning and city scale. Lauren Ferguson is a current PhD student at UCL's Energy Institute and IEDE. She joined UCL after working at the Wolfson Institute of Preventative Medicine. Her PhD project is a collaboration with Public Health England to assess how childhood exposure to indoor air pollution varies across socioeconomic groups. The project applies a modeling methodology to examine how building characteristics such as volume, air tightness, ventilation, and occupant behavior contribute to pollution, contribute to total population exposure, and how these factors may vary across households of different socioeconomic status. The tool that she's developing can assess how changes in building and/or environmental policies can modify population exposure to indoor air pollution. The work on this framework was recently published in Buildings and Cities. There's a couple of great publications out that Lauren is the first author on, so do a Google search for her work. I highly recommend both the papers. Dr. Duncan Mclaren is a professor in practice at and research fellow at the Lancaster Environment Center at Lancaster University, and a visiting researcher at Linköping University in Sweden. His research interests explore the justice and political implications of novel technologies, including climate engineering, circular economy, and smart cities, applying lenses adapted from science and technology studies, moral philosophy, and the environmental humanities. In his previous career, Duncan worked as an environmental researcher and campaigner, and recently as chief executive of Friends of the Earth Scotland from 2003 to 2011. He brings a novel perspective to this discussion with his work on the problem of interventions for large-scale societal problems, such as climate change, being imposed on the victims of the harm rather than the responsible parties taking appropriate actions, and how that misappropriation of responsibility may lead to mitigation deterrence. So it'll be interesting to see how we can come around through all of those things. I think we could probably go ahead and begin the presentation that Claire's put together on a bit of an introduction.
Yes, thanks very much, Elizabeth. It's very nice to be here and talk to people about air pollution. So I'll just give a bit of background, very sort of general, starting from the bigger picture. So air pollution is not a new problem for us, although we hear a lot about it nowadays, but it is a constantly evolving problem. So we had the things like the Great Smog in the 50s meant that there was such a large impact that the Clean Air Act was kind of accelerated by these kind of events. And then if we think about how exposure has changed over time, different generations have been exposed to different sources and concentrations of various air pollutants. So in the past, we were concerned with soot and coal burning and sulfur dioxide. And then there was a whole sort of generation exposed to leaded petrol. And then a little bit more recently, we're talking a lot about diesel engines, nitrogen dioxide, tropospheric ozone, which is slowly rising in the Northern Hemisphere, and carbon monoxide, which tends to be an indoor air problem. And then at present day, and then maybe the sort of pertinent issues of today, are things like biomass burning. We're talking about wood burning stoves for local air quality problems. And indoor air is becoming obviously a much larger focus, which is right, because we spend 90% of our time indoors, but we haven't paid it as much attention as outdoor air. And more broadly, the impacts of climate change on air quality and things like forest fires, for instance. So if we think about the pollutants of concern for the UK at the moment, we have particulate matter below 2.5 microns, so PM 2.5, nitrogen dioxide and ozone. So long-term exposure to particles has an effect equivalent to around 29,000 deaths a year in the UK. And if we include nitrogen dioxide to that, the figure could be up to 36,000 deaths a year. So it's usually a contributing factor to deaths. But there are also short-term impacts as well. So things like asthma and emergency hospital admissions for things like respiratory and cardiovascular conditions. So I'll just give you a couple of slides on a recent paper. So we were looking at emissions of key pollutants from the 1970s, basically. And you can see that sulfur dioxide, the red line, was tackled and brought to much lower levels through industry controls, basically. And along the bottom, you can see all the different policy measures which helped control these pollutants. And then nitrogen oxide and VOCs, they kind of increased into the 1990s, but then fell off more recently. Fine particulate matter, so PM 2.5 and smaller, they've declined throughout. Ammonia hasn't declined as much, and that's something that could potentially be something to look at as well. And if we look at population-weighted concentrations for sulfur dioxide at the top, and then nitrogen dioxide particles and ozone you can see the blue maps show general decreases in concentrations, and that the red show increases going from 1970 to 2010. So there's quite a lot of difference depending on which pollutant you're looking at. And then finally, we were able to express the changes in concentration as a health impact. So this graph here shows the attributable fraction of mortality in the UK attributed to each of these air pollutants. So for example, the green bars, you can see PM2.5 was responsible for around 12% of all mortality in the UK in the 1970s, and that's fallen to about half of that in 2010s. And nitrogen dioxide sort of rose into the 1990s, is now falling, and ozone has not kind of changed quite so much. So there is improvement, but it's very important to note that these levels are still above the safe limits for health. So they do present a health risk. And I think I'm handing over to Elizabeth now. Is that right?
Yeah, I just wanted to, because obviously this is the School of the Built Environment. I wanted to just remind everyone that that a lot of the background that Claire's given has been on outdoor air quality for good reason. Obviously, it is one of the considerations, one of the major considerations for indoor air quality. It is part of our, becomes part of our built environment, but other considerations for indoor air quality and things that I know are part of what of the analysis that Lauren does is looking at indoor sources. So things like cooking and smoking, the building envelope itself. So infiltration, the condition of the structure itself, whether or not it's in good repair or not. Then occupant behavior, things like how often windows are opened, extractor fan use. And then removal technologies, and of course my interest, portable air purifiers, but there's other ways of doing that, extractor fans of course, or whole building systems. Certainly most commercial office buildings, or many commercial office buildings, have some sort of filtration system. So simply a reminder that indoor air quality is the focus of the work or the discussion in a sense, but it's can't really be pulled apart from outdoor air quality. So just discussing that in a relationship, and let Lauren go on from here.
No, it's up to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. This is a diagram which shows the different relationships that drive indoor air quality. So it's kind of a systems approach where we outline the different drivers of indoor air quality, and really what we're trying to show here is that many of these things act to worsen indoor air quality are actually like outside of the control of the people that live in the buildings. So it's not something that can easily be remedied. So I don't know how well people can see it. I can't. But so they're color coded by the factors. So in green, you've got kind of housing characteristics. So features of the outdoor environment is one factor that drives indoor air pollution and outdoor air pollution. So for example, like how close you live to a road with with heavy goods vehicle access. And this isn't something, if you're living in those buildings, that can easily be remedied. So it's kind of a systemic inequality. Another example is, I'm trying to my eyes aren't very good, is something. So if you live in like social housing, the extent of ventilation that you might receive in so if you live in like a flat or a multi-unit building, so you wouldn't receive your dwelling wouldn't receive ventilation, so as much background ventilation as, for example, if you lived in like a detached building. So again, this is something that isn't really, it's within the control of the occupants that live there. So this diagram describes the factors which drive indoor air pollution exposure. Yeah, and they're color coded according to, so green is features of the outdoor environment, so neighborhood features. The dark green is housing characteristics. And you've got in pink, it's like occupant behaviors, so things like cooking and smoking. And this is one thing, like, this is one of the only things you could reasonably be expected to change if you, so you'd be like, okay, I won't smoke inside, for example, but the other factors are outside of your control. So in the paper, what this is from, we said it was like an indoor air pollution exposure is an area of systemic inequality. I'll speak a bit about that, speak a bit more about that today. Yeah. And these are all ways which, this is like a systems approach, ways which can remedy indoor air pollution exposure. And they target how the previous diagram is color coded. So they target actions within them, like 3 areas. So you've got improving outdoor environments, improving sort of housing quality and built form, and behavioral change. And you can target indoor air pollution exposure via these inroads. So again, it's like a systems approach, because you can, so I'm trying to read my own, yeah, you can target how you can reduce indoor air pollution and the inequalities therein. So it's things like maintaining ventilation systems in buildings, trickle vents, compartmentalizing flats so that you don't get like neighboring pollution. You don't get pollution from neighboring dwellings. So if someone in the flat next to you is smoking, if you tighten the building envelope of that flat, then you won't get as much ingression from a neighboring flat. So things like that. But I'll talk a little bit more about like the inequalities and how they act to worsen indoor air pollution. I think, should I hand back to?
Yeah. Thank you, Lauren and Claire, for that introduction to those people who may not be terribly familiar with the larger topic of air quality, particularly as it relates to the built environment. I'm now going to be moving to the panel discussion, and I'm going to start by picking on Claire. That's you, Claire. Claire and Lauren, despite the fact that they look like they're in different rooms, are actually in the same room. So they can riff off of each other a bit. But Claire, you've done such a nice job with a very brief overview of sort of ambient air pollution and the health effects. I know that is essentially an entire module that you could spend on that. But I also know that the focus of your research hasn't recently been indoor air quality in particular. So I hope this is a fair question. But in a paper that you co-authored with Carnell in 2019, from which I think some of those images were taken. That paper is, for those of you who want to look it up, entitled Modeling Public Health Improvements as a result of air pollution control policies in the UK over 4 decades, 1970 to 2010. You addressed the improvements in health in the UK as a result of air pollution control policies, not specific to indoor air, but with impressive reductions in PM 2.5 attributable deaths of about 56%. Not nearly as much a reduction for nitrogen dioxide and ozone, but those weren't as great of contributors to begin with. But for PM 2.5, really remarkable. You note that these improvements were driven predominantly by policy changes, policies aimed at reducing air pollutant emissions and improving air quality in the UK have been effective in leading to substantial decline in concentrations of priority air pollutants over the past 40 years. Do you think that the same type of policy change will be necessary to address the issues of indoor air quality? And if so, do you have any thoughts about how we might go about making these policies, especially with so many diverse and powerful stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And you're right that I think a good example of the outdoor environment and air pollution would be transport and cars, that a lot of controls on emissions from the tailpipe, basically, and changes to engine type, which has led a lot recently to changes in concentrations. Obviously, there have been industry sort of wide measures for many years, which have been quite effective. I think there's a problem that we potentially get to a kind of you can minimize the problem when it's a very severe problem, and then as you get smaller and smaller, it's more difficult to make changes in the future. So for things like cars, for example, although the engines are a lot cleaner, a lot of the emissions, like the particles from cars, now come from the brakes and the tires and things like that, and it becomes difficult to effectively limit anymore. So there are these problems because we still need to reduce air pollution if we want to improve health. And in terms of the indoor environment, I think you're right that there probably is the need for this kind of policy measure, because we know that the outdoor environment affects the indoor environment. We know that there's this relationship, and it can be modified by building types and different energy systems and ventilation and so on. But until now, I don't think there's been really a focus on sort of regulations. I'm not an indoor buildings person, but I think it's certainly the case that we need to take a lot more notice of things like cooking sources and chemicals used in the home, because it's becoming clear that that's a really huge exposure, and particularly for people who are quite vulnerable. So people who are generally vulnerable to air pollution, maybe elderly people who tend to spend quite a lot of time indoors anyway. And this is the kind of in which case we need to improve the indoor environment for people like them. So I can't speak directly about kind of regulations and building policy, but I do think it needs to be definitely considered in the same way that climate change, overheating is and insulation is a big topic for the indoor environment.
Great, thank you. I do have, as I think will happen for most of these answers, as I have questions. I have more questions for you, but I'll keep other things moving along, and maybe we'll get a chance to come back to some of that. Interested in the idea of sort of this diminishing returns, and when do we start? When you talk about in any case, I'll stop. Instead, I'll pose a question for you, Lauren. So your work, as you mentioned, is recently focused on systemic inequalities in terms of the poor indoor air quality. I don't know if you've had a chance to take a look at the framework that Claire helped develop, but if not, I mean, if yes, that's great, and perhaps can speak to that. If not, how are you approaching the analysis of exposure and health impacts to different socioeconomic groups?
So my work focuses on quantifying exposure. So I'm less, my area of expertise isn't on quantifying the health impacts, but I do think it's really important that we work together and have that crossover where so I would quantify exposure, because it makes so much. So it's one thing to be like, oh, people in low socioeconomic groups are exposed to 10 micrograms more particulate matter, and then it's another thing to be like, okay, and that's responsible, got a mortality attribute. So I think when you do add on the health, when you do quantify the health impacts and add on a mortality rate, you drive home the message more, because it can be kind of abstract, right? That to just say, oh, people in disadvantaged people or people in lower socioeconomic groups are exposed to higher concentrations, and you can say, so with a lot of my work, we'll try and quantify how much more air pollution they're exposed to, but it's still kind of abstract. And when you add on like, oh, and this is responsible for X amount of deaths, I think it puts it in context. So my work specifically doesn't quantify the health impacts, but I do think it's important that like people like Claire and I work together to do so, because that's how you would really highlight the problem and drive change, I guess.
Yeah, and maybe that gets to some of those policy questions. I think that policy makers, or at least those that are legislating, are interested in those in those numbers, in the quality adjusted life years and other metrics. Things they like to have metrics. So that's it's always an issue. And maybe speaking to that a little bit, Claire and Duncan, we'll get to you, I promise. So what I hope will be sort of an interesting segue then to comments then from Lauren to you, Claire, is the co-author paper describing the Euro Healthy project. So maybe this is a little bit of a touchstone on those. Can you explain a little bit about this project and the tools that are hoped to be developed as part of the project, in particular as they relate to ones that look at risk and benefit? Sort of what insights can you provide from the process of the development of the PHI, the tool or framework, and how do you imagine this tool or others might be used in the work of indoor air quality?
Yeah, so the project was a European project, and it was designed. It's called Euro Healthy, and it was designed to. It actually produced an atlas for public health. There's a publication, and you can look through, and every country in Europe has kind of different this index, public health index, with different demographics. And we were responsible for. I worked at Public Health England at the time, and we were responsible for the environmental part, because obviously public health is concerned with much broader than just the environment. But so getting back to what Lauren said, one of the important things is to link exposure to the health impacts. So it was very important that we that we could try to, rather than just using, maybe estimated exposure, the work that Lauren does, for example, it gives a kind of more detail on the actual exposure. So we were able to look at, different age groups, how people are exposed, and maybe using some modeling to get high resolution data and so on. But the whole project was, it was a big kind of slightly unwieldy in that it was, lots of multiple partners and so on. And we used what's known as the Delphi process, where you basically solicit opinions from academics and professionals, and you kind of refine your what is important, what are the key kind of aspects to look at, and then you have lots of rounds of kind of questionnaires basically, and then you kind of get into the detail a little bit more. And as I say, the product, there were lots of studies came from that paper, from that project, but the largest one was this atlas for health across Europe, and it was quite useful at comparing countries. So, for example, we compared Sweden with London and Athens, and we found that the things like green space were very high in Sweden, very low air quality issues in Sweden. Greece had very large air quality issues, and we looked at lots of things like car accidents, and it kind of cut across the whole board. So it's kind of useful to put each country in context and see what the particular issues are in each country. Hopefully it's useful for policymakers in that way.
I'm sure there will be questions on where is that accessible, or where is that available, or then how would people search for that in particular?
There's definitely if you just search Euro Healthy Atlas, I think it will come up. But my Google Scholar, it's probably it is on there. I think it's 2019. You can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I know that will come up. I did see a question, and I was going to type it, but someone asked the name of the paper.
Yeah, the other paper was a 2019 paper about emission controls from 1970. Again, that would be on Google Scholar.
Okay. Great. So yeah, Google Scholar. Claire has a Google Scholars page with, if not all of her past publications, at least most of them. So a good place for those listening to go and look for her work. And a reminder that I should probably do something like that myself. So, all right, now we have a question for you, Duncan. And this one starts by coming from a story out of the news that many people might be familiar with, which is the death of 9-year-old Ella Kissi-Debrah in 2013. Recently led to a landmark ruling in the UK law where poor outdoor air pollution was found to contribute to her death. This is the first time that's happened in the UK, and some media called this ruling the canary in a coal mine. So adding a little bit of my own recent research into the mix, there are a number of ways to improve indoor air quality on a case-by-case basis, not specifically speaking to Ms. Kissi-Debrah's case, but others. In particular, as I mentioned before, portable air purifiers are often marketed as a great approach to poor indoor air quality. And given your experience with this type of technological approach in your area of work, perhaps some examples of how it has or hasn't worked, especially given the close association, between your work in climate change and air pollution. the potential pitfalls and problems there.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks others for contributions so far. I'll just take a little step back and say, in a sense, my work is all inspired by the question of why we, as some sort of collective, don't do what we know we should. So in this case, we know hundreds of thousands, millions of people globally are dying from air pollution, yet for some reason we're on, at best in the rich countries, this slow downward trend, and in other countries, upward trends in air pollution. Data and metrics definitely are necessary and can help, but they're only one step. And I think my focus is particularly on the sort of cultural and political logics involved, and especially therefore what happens when technical or technological solutions, interventions that promise an improvement are on the table. And I guess my central conclusion to offer is that actually these things get very much overweighted, they're over-exaggerated in the current social and political world. And that's for two reasons. One, that people themselves, publics and politicians, are very scared about driving behavioral or lifestyle changes. So we've seen this sort of slow technological improvement of cars heading to electric vehicles now, much more than we've seen interventions to improve public transit and get people out of cars and onto bikes and walking, even though those would make bigger differences to the climate change emissions and indeed clearly to the air pollution emissions. At the same time, though, there's a real desire amongst politicians and business interests to avoid structural level, political level change. So keeping the power with the big companies that have power at the moment, keeping it in the same places and sustaining the globalized market economy. And one reason I think that's interesting to say in those ways is looking at Lauren's chart of what affects indoor air quality. She highlighted that there were these structural things that the individuals in the household could do nothing about. And then there were these behavioral things that maybe they could, but what I'm signaling is they would often find inconvenient. So when we look at a problem in this way, it's almost no surprise that technological solutions are things that people grasp at. What my work's shown in the climate change arena, though, is that by grasping at these solutions, we so often get a promise that doesn't deliver. We've seen that with nuclear power, we've seen it with carbon capture and storage. These things have been promised to us for decades as a way of cutting emissions and only ever at best slowly delivered. And this combines then to leave serious injustices in two dimensions. First, because of that delay, we're imposing an injustice on future generations. They're going to suffer more climate change, more of the problems, because we haven't acted as the current generation. And secondly, we're either exacerbating or at least continuing the current unequal distribution globally. And that's both of the problems. The impacts of climate change are being felt more by vulnerable populations, particularly in the global south. But also we keep coming up with responses that also potentially impose more burden on people in the global south and poorer populations. And focusing back down to internal air quality, I worry, I guess, more about the latter, that the more integrated solutions that involve structural and lifestyle changes are going to be resisted by the powers that be, by the political system. But the technological solutions like air quality, like indoor what do you call them? The HAPs, the things that remove particulates from the indoor air are expensive. And so that's likely that they will be most used globally by wealthy populations and not necessarily by the people who are most affected.
Thank you. Yeah, there's lots of, I mean, and you and I saw this, there's lots of, and others, we're not the only ones who are figuring this out. There's lots of places where climate change is overlapping with air pollution, not just in the obvious burning of fossil fuels causing increased rates of climate change and a bad air pollution, but in how the policies are being made and technologies and are being designed and implemented. And the last question I have for both Claire and Lauren, and one that might spark some comments from Duncan as well, is do you see climate change as having the potential of significant exacerbation on the inequalities in regards to exposure to air quality? And that's indoor and outdoor. So you can both.
Go first, or
No, you go.
are you sure?
Yeah, sure.
Could you unmute? So yeah, I mean, there are inequalities exist, and I know Lauren knows a lot more about this because this is what she's been really studying in depth. But inequalities in exposure, we know that they exist already, and a bit like how Duncan has outlined, that some of the solutions are going to be depending on means. So I think it is likely that the future isn't that we need to pay more attention to reducing inequalities as well as just reducing exposure, because this is something that we can target interventions better so that we can benefit more people. But there are sort of examples like clean air zones. We looked at this in the past, where in London the clean air zone is obviously a good thing for reducing air pollution, but there are potentially impacts on different groups of people. So some people have more money and they can afford just to simply pay the fee and still drive a polluting car, and there are some people who live in areas that are maybe slightly poorer areas where traffic is diverted to them. So therefore there are certain interventions that look like they're good, and they are generally, but they actually may be increasing inequalities. And in the same way with climate change, if we look globally, we are trying to reduce our emissions, but more developed countries have more means to implement these kind of changes, and we kind of are pushing the problem to elsewhere. So things like manufacturing, we don't do so much manufacturing, we don't but we rely on manufacturing from other countries. So it's actually our fault that sometimes that what we are not emitting directly, but we are indirectly emitting, I would say. Lauren, do you want to take over?
Yeah, so I think I think someone actually just mentioned it in the Q&A. When you have certain building interventions that are meant to combat climate change, so reducing space heating is something that the UK are really trying to target, and one of the things that they're doing is trying to make homes more airtight, so you've got less demand for you need to use the heating less, basically. And one of the things that we've looked at, and they do a lot of work on in UCL, is like when you tighten the building envelope, you reduce the extent of background ventilation, so you can actually make indoor concentrations worse. So if you're given an indoor source, the pollutant can build up inside. And there's been quite a lot of work on that at UCL and elsewhere, where they've found that these kind of building interventions, they're targeted at low income areas, so to make reduce things like fuel poverty, so the poorest homes to have their energy bills less, but in turn you can actually make the indoor air quality worse, because you're not. And this is so with the systems work that we did. I'm not an academic that looks at system dynamics, but that's what that a systems approach tries to like consider, that you can't just make interventions to the built environment in isolation. So anything you do, so if you're trying to reduce space heating in the context of climate change, you have to consider all these other things that you will affect. So I think any interventions that are put in place in the built environment in the context of climate change really have to consider these different things, such as indoor air pollution, and that's why like a systems-based approach, I believe, is the best way to go.
Thanks. It looks like we have already have a number of questions. Lauren addressed one, or started to address one already. I'll try to get through those that I can. The one that is sort of an interesting one, which is maybe something that Duncan wants to talk about, which is how has the outsourcing of polluting industry from the global north to the global south helped improve air quality in wealthier countries? And how do we remedy this systemic injustice? Just a tiny question.
Yeah. I mean, I'll give a comment because it's not precisely my area of expertise, but it certainly would seem to me that it's been a very significant contribution. The UK's relatively rapid decarbonisation and reasonably good performance on reducing or improving air quality that Claire told us about earlier has coincided with a period in which we have increasingly outsourced the location of industrial production. So we've closed down steel industries, we've largely closed down the car industry. We have also, though, transferred most electricity generation from coal to, there's now a lot of solar power, but mainly still gas power, and a slice of nuclear power. So it's not as simple as all the pollution's been shifted overseas, but certainly a slice of it has. And in some of the most egregious cases, back in the 1990s, and this wasn't an example from the UK, but an example from elsewhere in Europe, an entire car factory, a quite polluting one, was dismantled and shipped to a southern country. I can't remember exactly which one it was, and set up again. So transferring the pollution burden with it.
Thanks. And there's one question here which has a number of thumbs ups, which I guess are other users liking it. So I'm assuming it's a question that other people want to know. I don't know who wants to answer it, but it says China now is emphasizing the outdoor air quality extremely, such as blue sky, white cloud, beautiful environment. However, I could hardly hear the keywords about indoor air quality. Therefore, do excellent air quality outside lead to good air quality inside, or they have strong relationship, or should we concentrate on indoor air pollution and its solutions individually?
I can answer this one. So I think when a lot of the ways you can remedy indoor air quality are kind of butchered by the fact if you don't have clean outdoor air or cleaner outdoor air, you would struggle to ventilate. So for an indoor source, so if you smoke inside, the indoor air would be bad, right? And you could improve it by ventilating. But if you live in an area where there's poor outdoor air quality, then that might not be as effective. So to answer the question, I would say if you focus on clean outdoor air or cleaner outdoor air, you can remedy indoor air with ventilation and natural ventilation as well, which is better energy wise. So yeah, if I would focus on outdoor air, even though I work with indoor air, just because you can improve indoor air so much by just ventilating, just by opening windows. But obviously you're restricted if you live in an area with really poor outdoor air quality. Do you want to add?
Well, yeah, I think that's right. And there's sort of two angles that the outdoor does affect the indoor air. So it's important if we're going to ventilate, then the outdoor air quality needs to be good. But then there are different sources that only really affect indoor air, and things like cooking stoves in a lot of places are potentially bad sources. And yeah, smoking indoors is a pretty major source as well.
So I'd like to chip in and just sort of flip it over a little and say, well, Claire's absolutely right, or you're both right, that there needs to be action both ends of the equation. My worry from the studies that I've done in the climate area is if the indoor air quality in the homes of the wealthy can be improved through the use of air purifiers, that the motivation to clean up the outdoor air from vehicles and industry is reduced. And we need to be concerned about that sort of political vicious circle that could end up. I mean, I've heard that there are nurseries in China for the children of the wealthy people that have these purified, enclosed environments. They're going to worry less about dealing with the outdoor air if they feel that they are personally protected.
Thank you all. We are running out of time. I'm trying to see if there's a good way. There's still a few questions. A lot of the questions seem to ask similar questions about maybe the best way that what one thing can be done to make healthier air. There's some that sort of question. And I think several answers have been given already that obviously improving outdoor air and using that outdoor air to properly ventilate is the best way to improve indoor air. It's the problem is that we don't have air. We have areas and buildings that aren't properly ventilated, and that's a huge issue. And where you cannot properly ventilate, or where there are no ways yet of getting the outdoor air clean enough to use it to ventilate, we do need to come up with a way to remove the indoor particulates. So certainly individual behaviors, don't smoke in your home, don't burn incense or candles in your home, use your extractor hood if you have one when you're cooking. Those are probably the simplest individual things we can do. I don't, with so little time left, I don't know, does anyone want to add anything else before we're cut off? No. I hope it's been an interesting discussion for everybody. It has been recorded, I believe. Oh, decoration of the building influence indoor air. Of course it will. Yes, don't use source control. Keep all those chemicals outside of the home. Put them in the shed. Put them on the neighbor's porch. Whatever you need to do. But yeah, those are the sort of things to do. Obviously, all of us like to talk about air quality, so I think any of us would be happy to answer your questions. You can find us by email, and really appreciate everybody's interest and time, and thank you to all the panelists. Really interesting work, and look forward to working with you more in the future. And Nishat, is there anything else I need to do?
No, that's perfect.
Great. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. Bye.